The committee room was silent except for the shuffle of papers and the faint buzz of cameras adjusting their focus. Every seat was filled, every gaze locked toward the center table where tension had already started to simmer. At one end sat Representative Matt Gaetz, sharp, confident, and visibly impatient. Across from him, Special Counsel Robert Hur, calm but watchful, prepared to navigate what everyone already knew would be a long and relentless interrogation. The chairman struck his gavel once. The committee will come to order, but the order truthfully had left the room the moment Gaetz leaned toward his microphone. Mr. Hur, he began, we've read your report. We've seen the summaries. But what America wants to know, what this committee deserves to know, is simple. How do you write a report that documents evidence of classified information mishandling, and then refuse to recommend charges? Hur's tone was even, but his eyes betrayed no hesitation. Congressman, as outlined in the report, my conclusion was based on the totality of the evidence and the president's state of mind. Gaetz cut him off sharply. State of mind? You mean the same president who can't finish a sentence without forgetting what he started? You're telling this committee that mental decline is now a legal defense? Gasps rippled through the room. Hur remained composed. Congressman, the assessment was based on factors relevant to prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutorial discretion, Gaetz repeated with a sneer. That's a fancy way of saying double standard, Mr. Hur, because I don't recall the DOJ offering that kind of mercy to President Trump. The chairman tried to restore calm, but it was useless. Gaetz was on the attack. Your report, sir, reads like political theater, an act of protection dressed up as impartiality. You admit there were classified materials in Biden's possession, handwritten notes, briefings, sensitive data, all the same elements that led to raids and charges against Trump. Yet here we are, watching you dance around the obvious. Hur adjusted his glasses slightly. My responsibility, Congressman, was not to mirror other investigations but to follow the evidence before me. Gaetz leaned forward, voice rising. The evidence before you showed a crime. You just didn't have the courage to call it one. You hid behind empathy for a man who happens to sit in the Oval Office. Hur's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. I did not hide, Congressman. I followed the facts as any prosecutor should. The president cooperated fully, unlike Gaetz slammed a hand on the table. Unlike who? Say it. Unlike Trump? You've already implied it. Now own it. The room was buzzing now, reporters scribbling frantically. The chairman's gavel struck again. Gentlemen, let's maintain order. But the exchange had already captured the entire committee's attention. Hur continued, his tone deliberate. My report states that intent was a critical factor. President Biden's cooperation and his apparent confusion about the materials made prosecution untenable. Gaetz leaned back, almost laughing in disbelief. So we've established a new standard. Confusion equals innocence. Incredible. Maybe we should all start forgetting things in front of the FBI. The audience stirred, some chuckling under their breath, others shaking their heads. Hur didn't react. My findings are documented in full. The public can review them as they wish. Gaetz fired back. Oh, they've reviewed them, all right, and what they see is a Justice Department that bends over backward for Democrats and weaponizes itself against Republicans. The chairman interjected again, his tone exasperated. Congressman Gaetz, please, but Gaetz wasn't done. No, Mr. Chairman. The American people deserve to see what's really happening. They deserve to know why the same justice system that hounded Trump with FBI raids is suddenly sympathetic to Biden's memory lapses. This isn't justice, it's theater. And Mr. Hur, you're the director. For the first time, Hur's composure cracked slightly. That accusation is false and offensive, he said, his tone sharpening. I was appointed to conduct an independent investigation, and I did so without political pressure. Without pressure? Gaetz scoffed. Then tell me this. Did anyone from the White House contact your office during your investigation? Hur hesitated. It wasn't a long pause, but it was enough. The audience felt it. The slight hitch, the careful calculation before he replied. I received no improper communication. Gaetz seized on it immediately. Improper. Interesting choice of word. So there was communication, just not improper, according to you. Who contacted you? The chairman pounded the gavel again. Mr. Gaetz, your time is nearly expired. Then let me finish with this, Gaetz said, his voice now echoing through the chamber. You didn't exonerate the president, you excused him. You turned negligence into innocence, bias into procedure. And history will remember that. Hur didn't flinch this time. History will remember accuracy, Congressman, not theatrics. The room erupted again. Murmurs, whispers, even applause from a few in the back. The chairman raised his voice. Order! We will have order in this committee. But it was too late. The debate had ignited, and everyone in that chamber, from the lawmakers to the cameras, knew this was only the beginning of a political firestorm that would burn far beyond these walls. The moment the gavel struck, the sound echoed like a gunshot through the hearing room. The tension was palpable. You could almost feel the electricity pulsing between Matt Gaetz and Robert Hur. But before the energy had time to fade, another voice broke the silence. Representative Hank Johnson leaned into his microphone, his southern drawl cutting through the noise like a calm before the next storm. Mr. Herr, he began. I listened to that entire exchange, and what I heard wasn't justice, it was politics. You wrote a report that reads more like a campaign commercial than an investigation summary. You didn't just lay out facts, you injected opinions, particularly about the president's memory. Why? Her turned toward him, choosing his words carefully. Congressman, the statements in my report were necessary to explain my decision-making process. Johnson's eyes narrowed. Necessary? You mean necessary to paint a picture of a frail old man so cognitively impaired he couldn't possibly have intent. You didn't just exonerate the president, Mr. Herr. You humiliated him. The murmurs started again, echoing softly through the committee room. Herr's face remained composed, though his tone grew firm. I presented the facts as they existed. It is not my role to manage political consequences. Johnson leaned forward, his tone sharpening. But you knew the consequences. You knew how your language would be weaponized. You didn't have to include subjective descriptions of memory lapses or confusion, yet you did. That wasn't legal analysis, Mr. Herr. That was narrative construction. Herr took a slow breath. Congressman, the president's recollection was a relevant factor. It informed my judgment about whether intent could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt, Johnson repeated, shaking his head. Or beyond a political consequence. Because from where the public stands, your doubt gave the other side ammunition to attack this administration. Herr adjusted his tie slightly. My responsibility was to transparency, not partisanship. Johnson smiled faintly. Transparency? Funny word when half your report is redacted and the other half reads like an editorial. The audience reacted, small bursts of laughter breaking the heavy air. Herr stayed quiet, refusing to take the bait. Johnson continued. You were appointed as a special counsel to restore public trust, to show that no one, not even the president, is above the law. But instead you delivered a report that undermined that trust further. You didn't just question the president's intent. You questioned his competency, and that, Mr. Herr, is a political statement disguised as legal reasoning. Herr's jaw clenched. Congressman, my duty was to explain why no charges were warranted. If I had omitted relevant factors, I would have failed that duty. Johnson leaned back in his chair. You know what I think? You wanted to have it both ways. You wanted to avoid charges but still sound tough, so you framed the president as sympathetic but unfit, legally innocent but politically weakened. That's not justice, that's damage control. Herr's voice was steady but cold now. With respect, Congressman, your characterization is inaccurate. I followed the evidence where it led, nothing more. Johnson tapped his pen against the desk, eyes locked on him. And somehow it just happened to lead to the exact conclusion that kept Washington comfortable. No prosecution, no accountability, just another report written in lawyer's language so vague everyone can claim they were right. Herr responded evenly. If you believe the facts warrant different conclusions, the record is public. You're free to review it. Johnson's voice rose slightly, his tone taking on a sharper edge. Oh, we've reviewed it. The American people have reviewed it, and what they see is a justice system that prosecutes one man for possession of classified documents and excuses another for the same thing because he happens to forget where he put them. That's not equal justice, Mr. Herr. That's selective accountability. The room buzzed again, lawmakers shifting in their seats. Herr didn't break eye contact. The comparison you're making ignores key distinctions. Cooperation, intent, and obstruction. They matter, Congressman. They always matter. Johnson smirked. And yet every distinction somehow benefits the same side. The chairman rapped his gavel, trying to contain the chaos. Members will suspend. Let's keep this within the bounds of decorum. But the tone of the room had changed. This wasn't decorum. It was open warfare. Johnson leaned in once more, lowering his voice but amplifying its weight. You may believe you've closed this case, Mr. Herr, but all you've done is open a bigger one, on whether Americans can still trust the justice system you claim to serve. Herr replied quietly. Trust, Congressman, is built on truth, not politics. Johnson gave a faint smile. Then maybe Washington should start telling some. The chairman finally struck his gavel with finality. Time expired. As Johnson leaned back, Herr exhaled slowly, staring down at his notes, his composure unbroken but his silence louder than any statement he could have made. Around them, cameras clicked and the sound of whispers filled the air. Whispers that said what no one dared to speak aloud. This hearing wasn't about documents anymore. It was about something far deeper, whether justice in America was still blind, or if it had finally learned to pick sides. The tension barely had time to fade before the next lawmaker seized the microphone. Representative Elise Stefanik, her tone sharp and controlled, leaned forward with the poise of someone who had been waiting for this moment. The audience hushed, knowing exactly what kind of confrontation was about to unfold. Mr. Herr, she began. You claim your investigation was impartial, but I want to focus on something that speaks volumes about the double standard in Washington. Her voice grew more forceful with each word. When President Biden was found with classified documents scattered across his home and office, your report described him as a well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. But when Donald Trump faced similar accusations, the Justice Department treated him like a criminal mastermind. Tell me, where exactly is the equal treatment? Hur adjusted his glasses, visibly preparing himself for the political theater to come. Congresswoman, my report drew conclusions based solely on the evidence and cooperation we received. In President Biden's case, there was no obstruction. He voluntarily turned over materials and allowed interviews without delay. Stefanik cut him off mid-sentence. So cooperation earns you forgiveness now? Since when did the law operate on personality and politeness? Are you suggesting that the same offense becomes legal just because one man smiles during questioning? A ripple of reaction spread across the room. A few nods, a few raised eyebrows. Hers voice remained even. Intent and obstruction are not personality traits, Congresswoman. They are legal distinctions. The difference lies in willfulness, whether someone knowingly violated the law and concealed it. Stefanik leaned closer, almost whispering but loud enough for the microphones to catch. You just said it yourself. Knowing violation. President Biden himself admitted he didn't even remember when he had those classified materials. How can you prove intent when the man can't recall what he had for breakfast that day? Isn't that the very definition of incapacity? Hers expression didn't change. The standard for criminal prosecution isn't about perfect memory, it's about criminal intent. I did not find evidence that the president knowingly retained classified materials to obstruct justice or harm national security. Stefanik didn't blink. And yet you went out of your way to describe his memory problems in vivid, almost cruel detail. You didn't have to do that. You could have simply said insufficient evidence. But instead you painted a portrait of a man losing his faculties. That wasn't law, Mr. Hur. That was politics with punctuation. Hur's jaw tightened. Congresswoman, I stand by the report. The descriptions you reference were necessary to explain the context behind my prosecutorial decision. Necessary, Stefanik repeated, drawing out the word. Or convenient, because those same descriptions have now become political ammunition for every opponent this president has. You knew that and you still included them. You didn't just explain context, Mr. Hur. You shaped a narrative, one that the American people are now forced to live with. The crowd stirred again, cameras flashing like lightning. Hur looked toward the chairman but didn't ask for protection. He stayed steady, locked in. Congresswoman, I can't control how others interpret my work. My obligation was to document the facts as I found them. Stefanik's voice rose with that familiar congressional rhythm, half outrage, half performance. Facts? You left out the most important one, accountability. The same Justice Department that raided a former president's home with armed agents treated this president like a forgetful grandparent. You can dress it up in legal language all you want, but Americans see it plain as day. Two systems of justice depending on who you are and who you know. Hers reply was calm but deliberate. Congresswoman, if I had found obstruction, I would have recommended prosecution. I did not. She didn't back down. And the American people no longer believe that means justice was served. They believe it means justice was avoided. That line hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to clear. The room grew silent again. Every camera lens focused on her. He leaned slightly forward, speaking slowly and with conviction. If you want a justice system free from perception of bias, Congresswoman, then Congress must stop turning every legal decision into political theater. Stefanik's lips curled into a sharp, tight smile. Then maybe, Mr. Hur, you shouldn't have written your report like a screenplay. Gasps and laughter rippled through the chamber. The chairman struck his gavel once, twice, calling for order. But the damage was already done. The point made. The tension deepened. As Stefanik sat back, the look on her face said it all. This wasn't about classified documents anymore. It was about perception and about the way justice feels, not just how it's written. Hur remained silent, his face unreadable, but the energy in the room had changed. The hearing had turned into something far larger, a public reckoning over truth, trust, and the political games that shadow every decision in Washington. And as the next representative prepared to speak, it was clear that what had started as a hearing was now a full-blown trial, not just of one man's actions, but of an entire system that millions of Americans had stopped believing in. The next to take the floor was Representative Jim Jordan, and the mood shifted instantly. The Ohio congressman leaned forward, his sleeves slightly rolled up, his tone sharp, the kind of sharpness that comes from years of political combat. The energy in the room thickened. Everyone knew what was coming. Jordan wasn't here to ask questions, he was here to prosecute. Mr. Hur, he began, his voice cutting through the hum of side chatter. I want to be absolutely clear about something before we go any further. Your report says President Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified materials, but then you declined to prosecute. Now, where I come from, that sounds like saying someone stole a car, but you're not pressing charges because they were polite about it. How does that make sense? Her straightened slightly, his tone still careful and composed. Congressman, the distinction is crucial. The evidence did not support proof beyond a reasonable doubt that President Biden acted with the necessary intent. Jordan slammed the table lightly with his hand. Not in anger, but in emphasis. There it is again, intent. You keep hiding behind it. Let's talk about that. The special counsel investigating President Trump said he had intent. You say Biden didn't. You say one is criminal, the other confused. But I've read your report, Mr. Herr. You literally wrote that Biden knew he possessed those documents. You even described him reading from them aloud to his ghostwriter. You mean to tell me that's not intent? Herr met his gaze, refusing to flinch. Congressman, as I stated in my report, President Biden's actions lacked the mental state required for criminal conviction. He did not appear to recall the material's classification status or its sensitive nature. Jordan leaned back in disbelief. So the defense now is forgetfulness? Since when did amnesia become a legal loophole? You're saying the President of the United States, the man with access to nuclear codes, can mishandle top-secret materials and get a pass because he might not remember doing it. The audience reacted audibly. Some laughter, some murmurs of agreement. Herr paused, letting the room settle before answering. Congressman, the issue isn't whether the president remembered every detail. It's whether he acted willfully and obstructed justice. Those are not the same. Jordan wasn't letting go. Let's test that logic. Trump kept boxes at Mar-a-Lago. You say that's obstruction. Biden kept folders in his garage next to his Corvette. You say that's cooperation. One gets raided, the other gets excused. Are you listening to yourself? Herr's tone stayed neutral, but his words were firm. The situations differ in crucial ways, including responses to official requests and evidence of intent to conceal materials. President Biden immediately returned documents when discovered. Jordan's sarcasm flared. Yeah, after his lawyers found them. Not him, his lawyers. And only after his presidency began. Funny how that works. Herr started to reply, but Jordan pressed forward, his rhythm now rolling like a prosecutor before a jury. You wrote in your report, and I quote, that President Biden presented as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. You're not a doctor, are you, Mr. Herr? Herr hesitated. No, Congressman. A teenager appeared on screen looking into the camera. Judge Cannon, you sent my mom to prison for trying to take care of us. She made a mistake and owned it. You said our circumstances didn't matter. My little brother still cries for her every night. We lost our home. I had to leave school to work. You let rich people who stole millions walk. How is that justice? The room froze. People in the gallery wiped at their eyes. Cannon's composure collapsed. Crockett's voice carried quiet but resolute. That young woman wanted to be here today, but she couldn't miss work. Unlike defendants who get your mercy, her family is still paying for your brand of justice. She spread more files across the table. I have 47 similar cases. Single parents, hourly workers, people who made small mistakes and met your full wrath. And 23 cases where wealthy, connected defendants walked away with slaps on the wrist. The pattern is obvious, Your Honor. 2 systems of justice, one for the powerful and one for everybody else. Cannon tried a last pivot. Congresswoman, you're not a judge. You don't understand the complexities. I understand perfectly, Crockett shot back. I understand you've lost sight of what justice means. I understand your courtroom has become a political tool. And I understand you've betrayed the oath that Robe represents. She gathered her papers, then paused. One final question, Judge Cannon. Think carefully because you're under oath. The air held. Can you look at that young woman's video and honestly say you've applied the law equally to everyone who came before you? Cannon sat still, silent for 10 seconds. 20-30 cameras captured each beat of the non-answer. What should have been the simplest assurance a judge could give? Chairman Jordan finally pounded the gavel. I yield back, Crockett said, taking her seat. The damage was done. Judge Cannon's prepared lines were useless against the stacked record on the table. When Republicans tried to rehabilitate her with friendly questions, her answers turned halting and thin. The earlier swagger was gone, replaced by the look of someone suddenly exposed and unable to justify what the public had just seen. The hearing technically continued for another hour, but the outcome was already written. Every line of questioning from that point forward seemed to orbit the examples Crockett had laid out. Democrats, newly energized by what they'd just witnessed, pressed on with specifics that echoed her documentation. Some Republicans kept to their scripts, but the energy had shifted. Even a few on the majority side looked uneasy as the record on the table refused to be wished away. When Judge Cannon finally rose from the witness chair, she moved quickly, eyes avoiding the gallery. The woman who had entered with absolute confidence now looked shaken, exposed, and most damaging for a judge, unable to defend her own choices. Within minutes of adjournment, the clip of Crockett's 7-minute sequence tore across social media. Crockett exposes Cannon rocketed to the top of trends worldwide. The teenager's video spread at lightning speed, millions of views piling up as legal communities and ordinary viewers alike processed what they'd seen. Legal Twitter flooded with threads unpacking each case Crockett cited, matching the claims against public dockets and reporting. The same patterns backed the analysis checked out. On air, CNN's longtime legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin looked stunned. In 4 decades of covering courts, he said, "I can't recall a federal judge so comprehensively dismantled in a public forum." Representative Crockett didn't just grill Judge Cannon. She presented a structured case that would survive in any courtroom. Over at Fox, the early spin called it a partisan attack. A primetime host framed it as political theater, but even some conservative legal voices hesitated to defend what had been exposed. In The Hill, Professor Jonathan Turley wrote that the compilation raised serious questions about judicial bias that cannot be shrugged off as mere politics. By midweek, the Judicial Conference of the United States announced a preliminary review of the matters flagged in the hearing. 3 state bar associations called for formal ethics inquiries. Scholars across the ideological spectrum signed an open letter urging accountability mechanisms to address what they termed pattern-level deviations in judicial behavior. And yet the consequences reached beyond a single judge. Crockett's method, meticulous research, targeted exemplars, and an unmistakable pattern, instantly became the new benchmark for oversight of the federal judiciary. Law schools began assigning the hearing transcript in advocacy and professional responsibility courses. The teenager whose message had cut through the jargon found herself at the center of a national conversation about sentencing fairness. Donations poured in for her education, and she spoke at reform panels about how a judge's decision can reverberate through a family's life. Her mother's case quickly became a shorthand example in debates over equal justice. Judge Cannon tried to ride out the storm. She released a carefully worded statement, dismissing the hearing as political spectacle and insisting that her opinions were grounded in law. But the more independent analyses accumulated, and the more additional rulings surfaced that fit the same pattern, the less sustainable that posture became. Within 3 months, she was quietly reassigned to a reduced civil docket. Several of her contested decisions were reversed on appeal, with higher courts citing clear legal error, judicial language for the deeper problem Crockett had highlighted in plain English. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett vaulted into national prominence. Her alma mater announced a scholarship in her name. Invitations arrived from the American Bar Association, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and law schools across the country. Her social following exploded by the millions. More consequential than any of that, a criminal justice reform bill she had fought to advance, stuck in committee for months, suddenly attracted scores of co-sponsors. Still, she kept the focus off herself. In a 60 Minutes interview, she said, "This was never about me versus Judge Cannon. It was about the promise we make in this country that justice is blind and the law applies equally. When judges forget that promise, it's our responsibility to remind them." Politically, the hearing scrambled expectations. Republicans who had planned to hold Cannon up as an emblem of judicial persecution now found themselves scrambling for safer ground. Senators who'd once touted her jurisprudence began hedging. The Federalist Society stopped featuring her as a speaker. Democrats galvanized, initiated broader inquiries into systematic bias. They embraced Crockett's framework, show the pattern, prove the inconsistencies, and tie them to concrete outcomes. Within half a year, 3 other federal judges encountered similar scrutiny. 2 opted to retire rather than face hearings. Legal scholars would later call the day a hinge point. Harvard's Lawrence Tribe wrote that Representative Crockett had done more in one session to restore faith in congressional oversight than years of prior efforts, demonstrating that preparation and proof could still check power. The image that endured wasn't Cannon's assured entrance or her faltering exit. It was the split screen during that final question. Crockett standing firm behind a table strewn with documents and the judge silent, unable to answer whether she had applied the law equally. 6 months later, the teenager from the video received a full college scholarship from an anonymous donor. The accompanying note read, "Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Keep going." People drew their own conclusions about who sent it. The mystery only amplified the moment's resonance. Judge Cannon's reputation never recovered. Historians would later note that her public standing ended not with a formal sanction, but with a question she could not answer. Crockett, by contrast, kept pushing in Congress, armed now with a national platform and bipartisan respect from attorneys who might disagree with her politics, but admired her command of the record. When a young law student asked what advice she'd give to those challenging power, Crockett said, "Do the homework, know their record better than they do, and remember, facts are the great equalizer. Power can intimidate, but it can't out-argue evidence." Reform didn't stop at the water's edge of that one hearing. New standards for judicial transparency took shape, including periodic disclosures on sentencing patterns and regular audits to test consistency across similar cases. Analysts coined the Thompson-Hartley test, named for the two matters Crockett contrasted, as a way to examine whether equal law was being applied to unequal defendants. A year on, the ABA gave Crockett its Champion of Justice Award. She dedicated it to public defenders who fight for equal treatment and to defendants who never received it. The ovation reportedly lasted 5 minutes. A prominent legal blog summed up the moment this way: Crockett didn't just win a viral exchange. She raised the bar for judicial accountability. Every federal judge now knows rulings are being tracked and patterns, good or bad, will be chimed. 2 years out, Judge Cannon mentioned the hearing only in a single paragraph of her memoir. "I was unprepared for the depth of analysis Representative Crockett brought to bear. In retrospect, I should have been more aware of how my rulings might look in the aggregate." Every judge should learn from that experience. It was the closest she came to an admission. The case files Crockett had referenced were digitized and made public, quickly becoming a standard resource for researchers probing bias in judicial outcomes. The Brennan Center for Justice launched the Crockett database to track trends in rulings nationwide. Within its first year, researchers identified worrisome patterns in dozens of courts, prompting targeted reforms and affecting millions. But perhaps the most profound shift took place in the hearts of aspiring lawyers. The sight of a first-term representative dismantling a well-defended narrative using only primary documents, a methodical structure, and patient restraint changed how a generation thought about advocacy. Law school applications from underrepresented communities spiked, with many applicants citing the hearing as their inspiration. In the courthouse where Cannon had once presided, public defenders reported subtle but real changes: more reasonable plea negotiations, greater care in sentencing explanations, and a general sense that each case might be part of a larger pattern someone could surface later. The specter of becoming the next judge exposed for bias proved a powerful deterrent. 3 years after the hearing, Congress passed the Equal Justice Act, mandating annual reviews of sentencing disparities and establishing a civilian oversight board for the federal courts, a measure informally dubbed Crockett's Law. At the signing, Jasmine Crockett stood behind the president, the same folder in her hands that she'd carried into the hearing room. The image of that folder, ordinary manila bulging with receipts, became a symbol for a simple idea: power is not proof. Documentation is. Ms. Thompson, the mother in the case that had torn at the room, was ultimately released on appeal, her sentence reduced to time served. When she walked out, Crockett was there to meet her. The photo of their embrace, her children around them, became one of the most shared images of the year, captioned by countless users with a phrase the teenager had spoken: "Justice delayed but finally delivered." Professional responsibility classes across the country began requiring students to watch the key moments from the hearing. The final question: can you honestly say you've applied the law equally? Acquired a nickname, simply the question. Professors used it as a litmus test for judicial integrity, challenging students to consider how they would defend their own records if subjected to the same scrutiny. Eventually, Judge Cannon left the bench entirely and moved into private practice, focusing on corporate compliance, advising organizations on withstanding rigorous review. She declined public interviews about the hearing, but colleagues said she kept a photo from that day on her desk, not of herself but of Crockett standing at the microphone, A reminder perhaps of how quickly power can dissolve under the heat of accountable truth. The ripple effects spread outward. Courts adopted dashboards to flag outlier sentencing. Confirmation hearings for judicial nominees began to feature data-driven questioning modeled on Crockett's approach. Practitioners coined a term for the technique, pulling a Crockett, meaning to expose contradictions with a carefully built record from the subject's own words and decisions. 5 years after that fateful day, Jasmine Crockett raised her right hand and took an oath as a federal judge, nominated by a president who cited her unyielding commitment to equal justice and confirmed with bipartisan votes. In her investiture, she promised to remember that justice isn't about the judge, but about the people standing before the bench. Commentators noted the symmetry. The woman who had asked the question would now be responsible for living up to it, answerable to the same standard she demanded of others. At a graduation ceremony soon after, the young woman whose video had riveted the nation crossed the stage to accept her law degree. The keynote speaker was Judge Jasmine Crockett. Years ago, she told the graduates, "A brave teenager reminded the country that behind every caption and case number stands a human story. Justice is not abstract, it's personal. It must be equal." The auditorium rose in a standing ovation as that young woman, now a new lawyer, announced she would become a public defender. A documentary titled The Question, How Jasmine Crockett Changed American Justice aired to critical acclaim and won multiple Emmys. It featured scholars, defendants affected by disparate rulings, and even judges who admitted the hearing made them rethink their approach. A former clerk of canons, speaking anonymously, said the quiet part out loud. "That day changed us. We all asked ourselves, could I answer that question?" Beyond U.S. borders, the hearing was cited by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in a report on accountability. The European Union invited Crockett to speak on legislative oversight. Law faculties in Tokyo and London built case studies around the method. 10 years later, the Harvard Law Review ranked the confrontation among the most consequential congressional hearings in American history, alongside the Army McCarthy and Watergate hearings. The editors wrote that where other sessions exposed corruption or abuse, this one revealed something more pervasive: the subtle, systematic tilt in justice that quietly denies equal treatment, and then sparked reforms that actually stuck. On the 10th anniversary, NPR aired a retrospective featuring people whose lives had shifted because of the post-hearing reforms. A small business owner described avoiding prison thanks to more balanced guidelines. A wealthy executive described being held properly accountable under standards that treated his status as irrelevant. Public defenders spoke of benches more careful with explanations, more consistent across similar facts. The most striking interview was with Ms. Thompson's son, the little brother who had cried every night, now a criminal justice major. He said Representative Crockett didn't just expose one judge. She showed us someone was watching. She gave us hope the system could change, and it did. That same day, Crockett had released a memoir, The Question, with proceeds funding legal aid. "I walked into that room with a folder and a question," she wrote. "I walked out with a movement. But the heroes are the families who lived under unequal justice and still found the courage to speak." For the first time, Judge Cannon, now fully retired, issued a brief statement acknowledging what many had long believed. The hearing had been a turning point for American justice. She called accountability responsibility, not persecution. Observers noted it was the nearest she'd come to recognizing the validity of what had been shown. Over time, the standard Crockett championed took root. Bias once hidden in single decisions became visible when mapped across a judge's full docket. The question, "Can you honestly say you've applied the law equally?" shifted from a rhetorical flourish to an expectation enforced by data and review. The teenager at the center of the flashpoint became a public defender, later a reform-minded prosecutor, and ultimately a judge. When she took her oath, Judge Jasmine Crockett administered it, completing the circle. "My mother went to prison because a judge forgot that justice should be blind," the new judge said. "Today, I swear never to forget." Historians would mark the hearing as the moment American justice began nudging back toward its ideals. Not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably, and it began with a first-term Congresswoman from Texas who did her homework, brought receipts, and asked a question a federal judge could not answer. The folder Crockett carried that day sits in the Smithsonian, now part of an exhibit on moments that changed the nation. Next to it lies the transcript open to the page with the final exchange. Visitors stand long minutes absorbing the simplicity of the ask and the weight of the silence that followed. A small placard reads, "On this day, Representative Jasmine Crockett reminded America that truth armed with evidence can still confront privilege and win. Justice is not about who you are, but about what is right. One prepared voice can make the system bend." Each year on the anniversary, first-year law students watch the footage. The judge's confidence draining, the Congresswoman's steady resolve. The instant when a question becomes a reckoning. Faculty tell them the lesson is not to seek a dramatic moment, but to build a record so sturdy it speaks for itself. Methodical, documented, fearless. The hearing room itself earned a new informal name, the Crockett Chamber. A small plaque by the door carries her line from that day. Justice isn't about the judge. It's about the people who stand before us. Anyone entering to testify or to question sees at first a reminder that authority is temporary, but answerability endures. In casebooks now, Judge Eileen Cannon's name appears as a caution, an object lesson in how patterns once seen in full can eclipse any single opinion. In those same pages, Jasmine Crockett stands as the representative who reset expectations for how the people's branch can check the judicial one, armed not with bluster, but with facts. Oversight, her work demonstrated, isn't theater. It's the guardianship of equal justice under law. If this story moved you, pitting courage against privilege and proof against power, share it with someone who needs to remember that systems can change. Leave a note about a time you watched truth prevail or a time you spoke up when it was hard. Justice isn't a favor bestowed by the powerful. It's a right we defend daily. And as the day in the hearing room showed, sometimes everything turns on one question asked at the right moment with the evidence to sustain it.